My name is Manish Gupta. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO of Indegene.
The 90s saw the advent of companies like Infosys that leveraged Indian talent to service the software needs of the developed countries. In the next decade were born companies like Indegene, who leveraged Indian talent to service more niche needs of companies in developed countries. In this episode of the Founder Thesis Podcast, your host Akshay Datt is talking with Manish Gupta, the co-founder and CEO of Indegene, which is a full-stack service provider to global pharma companies. Indegene was started in an era when VC money was not flowing like it is today. And the way to build a business was by making it profitable. In this episode, Manish talks about Indegene's journey of sustainable scaling, starting with helping pharma companies with content and training to eventually becoming the full-stack behemoth that it is today with a few acquisitions along the way. Indegene is all set for an IPO which intends to raise 3,200 crore rupees from public investors. And this episode is a masterclass in sustainably scaling a global business. Stay tuned and follow the Founder Thesis Podcast on any audio streaming app to learn more about the sustainable scaling and global expansion.
So I was born long time back in 1972 in Lucknow. My father was a scientist and he retired from a place called CDRI, the Central Drug Research Institute. He was the director of CDRI when he retired. My dad went to the United States to do a postdoc. For a very brief period of time, he was in Palo Alto, then moved to Boston. He was in MIT doing his postdoc with actually Professor Hargobind Khurana, who was one of the Indian Nobel Prize winners in genetics. Came back in 78, back to Lucknow. I went to the school in Lucknow called La Martiniere. Finished my class 12 in 1990, then joined BHU, IIT BHU. Did my mechanical engineering from there. After that, I decided to do an MBA, went to IIM Ahmedabad and did my MBA over there. I passed out in 98, joined a bank actually right after that, ANZ Greenlays.
ANZ Greenlays was a very hot pack that time. They had recently entered India. They must have been like a day zero, day one company.
Yeah, absolutely. So they were way up. I got a job over there. And very quickly after 8.5 months, joined Infi. And Infi was a very small firm, right?
You must have been directly working with the co-founders at that time.
Not really. They were still a large firm. In fact, 5 days after I joined, they had their ADR listing. They had just crossed $100 million, I think 4,000 people. So it was a well-known, successful firm by that time. But started talking to some of my co-founders, especially one of them who was senior of mine from IIM Ahmedabad. And he was a medical doctor, Dr. Rajesh Nair.
And where was he working?
So he was working with, his stint was with Sarabhai Labs in pharma in Ahmedabad. He also had opted out of placement first campus. I think he was also not designed to work in corporate. So started talking to him, bunch of others.
What was the trigger that you said, okay, let's quit and start this?
One was there is that going back to that impatience thing from my perspective, there was restlessness. That whole thing of doing things step by step. I just want to do much more than what I was doing in life over there. And you realize that in a corporate setup, after some point in time, that becomes very difficult to do. I would say that was the bigger trigger. And then second is that again, 99, 98 to 2000, 2001, the general environment had entrepreneurship in the air a little bit. There was a whole thing of starting up. It was I would say.
This was like US inspired dotcom.
Yeah, absolutely. So that a lot of that stuff was going on. See, when you're 25, 26, like most of the people, the opportunity always is you think that you know what, you're going to change the world. Our thing was that healthcare has many inefficiencies and you could solve them by bringing medical, healthcare and technology expertise together. Our thesis was that tech guys don't understand medical domain, which is a very nuanced domain. It's not as straightforward as many other things. The risks are much higher if you go wrong. And the medical guys, of course, don't understand the technology domain. And if we could build a firm which has the DNA of really interweaving these two capabilities together, we could solve various problems in healthcare. And we were inspired by a bunch of things happening in the US that point of time. There was a device called Palm Pilot, which was become very popular. I don't know if you've ever seen that. And by the way, very popular in the medical area.
Doctors would keep their notes on it.
Absolutely. Not only notes, you can actually, for example, if you want to prescribe a drug, you can pull out and see drug interaction. Our thought was you can get your lab report right there. On the Palm Pilot, you can make these connections. So there are a bunch of things we thought we could do. So there's a company called Healthion, which had got massive funding in the US. Jim Clark, who was a legend. So they're bringing patient records, insurance, bunch of things together. And doctor community was one of the facets.
Like a combination of drug-related content and patient records, like patient record digitization.
Yeah. So the drug-related content, actually not only drug-related content, it was disease-related content also, disease and drug. So you'll be relevant to the physician, and just drug-related content would not make you relevant to the physician. Physicians, our whole thesis was that you got to become a one-stop shop of information and knowledge for them. And they learn from various things. They learn from peers, they learn from journal articles, they learn from various cases which have been in different parts of the world and in the country. So how do you facilitate information around some of these things? And of course, drug-related information. But that was a very small piece, the drug, and probably the easier part. But how do you build disease-related stuff was the bigger theme. And our thesis was that once you do that, then you can bring in pharma companies into the fold. They would want to partner with you. You get pharma companies to physicians and do various things, market, trials, bunch of things. So our third step was getting labs and hospitals onto the chain. That was our broad plan. And we raised some bit of seed capital in 2000 based on this plan.
Wow. Was there really an ecosystem where you could raise, or like?
There were a couple of VC firms which had got started in India, and especially the international ones. There was obviously ICICI Ventures, an Indian firm, and then you had a few Indian state firms which were there, but there were two firms. One was called eVentures. I don't know if you remember the name. eVentures was a firm, but the firm which invested in us was called Ant Factory. Ant Factory was a British origin VC firm, and they set up an India shop. So we were the first investment in India from Ant Factory.
Amazing. And how much did you raise?
It was 350K or 400K, which by the way was not even large amount of money even those days. We raised that money, started building and executing on this plan. So the first thing which we did is the tech platform and a content engine, which meant not only from a tech perspective, but how do you source content, right? In the first place, which is relevant to physicians. So we went out and built, and this was first focused on India because in 400K, you couldn't have done much more than that. So we did partnerships with a lot of the leading academic centers in India, the likes of AIIMS, PGI, some of the private hospitals. We built relationships and alliances with a lot of the leading physicians in the country. What we also did is there were multiple marquee medical conferences, especially the national level ones which happened. We took content rights for all of them. We signed up those deals. So we tied up the content ecosystem. We built an internal team to develop content. We built a technology team to make sure this content can be processed and updated very quickly to be used to physicians while it's still topical. And then parallelly, we started working on all this lab, hospital kind of stuff I had spoken about. How do you connect these people? So that's what we were executing on, but we were doing things in a systematic, I would say, prudent way. That's when somewhere in 2000, by 2000 end or so, you could start seeing the market turning south, or say mid to that's when things start going south from a market sentiment perspective.
Did you have enough money in the bank at this stage?
So by this point of time, we were pretty much running out of cash. We had a few lakhs left.
And what was your monthly burn rate, or like your payroll cost?
It wasn't much. As you can imagine, if you could stretch 400,000 for 2 years, so that wasn't really much. We had started making some revenues from pharma, by the way. I still remember in 2001 March, we closed 25 lakhs of revenue, which was pretty much first year of real operations.
So this would mean you had traffic. Like the only way to make revenue is if you can monetize traffic.
So it was not necessarily traffic. What we started doing is that we started seeing this writing on the wall, and nobody was willing to pay for the website. That was very small amount of money. But this whole conference content, we started selling to doctors directly first. That was one stream.
And what do you mean by conference content? Are these recorded videos, or is this like a
No, recorded video nobody would buy, but what we would add is medical education on top of that. Discussions with prominent physicians on a particular case, or some content which you would have got from abroad, one of the centers like Hopkins, Cleveland, what are those type of places. We started using that.
Mix of video and text.
Absolutely.
And you were selling like in CDs? Because
that point of time, what sold was CDs. We started with online, but realized online is not going to go anywhere. It's going to be go show off. Yeah. And we had done our first CME online, continuing medical education program online. We had done something on TV. By 2001, it was very clear to us that either we packed and go back home and look for jobs, or do something completely different, or the last option was that you truly monetize what you had. And monetize was not in just generating revenues. You had to generate profits and cash flows over here, because depending on external funding was not going to be easy. And we decided that we will just do the last, that we will very quickly monetize whatever we have built. And we had seen early signs of pharma being a place where we could do this. The biggest thing was we started off with selling to doctors directly. That listen, there's no way you would have attended all the sessions. There are tons of other things which are happening in your area. Here is a product you can buy for that. And the good part is that given what we had built earlier on the website, we had started building credibility with doctors anyway. In 2000 itself, Lancet, which is one of the most reputed medical journals globally, had covered us as one of the most credible sources of information in this part of the world. So that was a good thing, which we obviously used to leverage a lot over here, given that we had these relationships with medical institutes. So doctors, there was some bit of credibility. I won't say massive, but it's still early days. But using that, we could sell to doctors. Now, what really happened is doctors don't like to pay.
Nobody in India likes to pay for content.
Now, when pharma saw that, here is a stall in a conference and there's a queue of doctors who are paying advance for content they will get 6 weeks later or 4 weeks later, what the hell is going on? So they saw that, and then they came back, pharma started coming to us and saying, listen, instead of doing this selling to doctors, why don't you sell this to us over here? What we will do is use our reps to distribute this content. And all they wanted is some branding and all that stuff of theirs, which was a much more doable business model for us over here. So that's one thing which we started selling to pharma. The second thing is that given that we had this medical expertise, given that we had relationships, many times we started pitching to pharma that, if you're going to launch a product or if you're getting into an area, pharma companies were doing what is called market development. For your drug to sell well, you need to make sure that doctors understand the disease area itself. There's enough and more diagnosis happening. How do you educate physicians about this whole thing? So we would start developing content and programs to be able to do all this effectively. And on one hand, we were leveraging the conference thing. Other hand, we were doing de novo content to solve various problems, right?
What is de novo?
From scratch, not as we would develop. For example, if there's something which we had done is that there's a once a day antibiotic being launched in India. There were none at that point of time. Demonstrate that with the Indian population that, this has the same efficacy or better efficacy than what is existing in the market. So doing trials on patients, collecting data, then generating content from there. I remember a program we had done for educating doctors how to diagnose DVT, deep vein thrombosis, in the first place. Over here, you realize that deep vein thrombosis was becoming prevalent in the country, but doctors don't know how to diagnose it well enough. And if they want to diagnose it, then obviously they want to write a prescription on that. From a pharma perspective, it was important and that's what market development was. If you're a forward-looking pharma company, you would help the whole ecosystem understand this better. So we started doing that for many disease areas.
You would do like workshops or maybe you had some sort of literature that you were mailing out.
So a combination of all these and multiple channels. You'll have a website, you will still do probably a CD, you'll do workshops. We will still have some of these computer-based things, the tech angle, and our differentiation was coming from there. There could have been people, small shops, who could still do the workshops and all that, but we will always bring the tech angle it was, I would say, more coolness from a differentiation perspective. It's not that pharma was really or doctors were buying the tech, but it differentiated any company doing this thing. So using that, we continue to build a business model. In reality, some of the tech part was getting underplayed. What we had started off as a tech muscle was not being leveraged to the full extent, which was unfortunate for the next, I would say, 3-4 years. That's what happened. But to stay afloat and survive.
Essentially, you were running it like a services business.
Yeah, absolutely. We were running it as a services business and a very pure play services business with a very small component of tech in this place. So we, by the way, continue to grow on this. I still remember the first few years revenues. I remember after that I blank out. For example, this 25 lakhs jumped to 2.2 crores. 2.2 crores jumped to 4.47. Then that jumped to 7 crores.
By when was it 7 crores? 2004 or 5 or so?
So you could do 2001, 2002 was 2.2, 3 was 4.4. So 4 would have been 7. And we also had turned profitable, not great margins, but just profitable. But the challenge we always had is that we always stretched on cash flows. Pharma in India didn't pay on time. First of all, the payment terms would be bad. And this is intellectual property. First time they were buying at this level, this 60, 90 days will become 180 days. And if you're paying out of your salaries, out of these cash flows, that was a problem. So as founders, for example, all of us didn't take any cash out for almost 2 years, which was not an easy thing to do given the backgrounds we came from. And it's not that we had long corporate stints, that we had massive savings. Whatever was there had been burned initial days in the company itself. So that was a big stress.
Tell me that name, Indegene, just a quick diversion here. What does it mean, or why did you choose it?
So it is a combination of a bunch of things. This is my co-founder Rajesh who came up with this name, India angle. If we wanted to have an India angle, have this biology thing, you're thinking of innovation always, which had the word indigenous. So playing with all these things, the name Indigene came in and sounded like a good name. By 2003-04, we were stepping back and saying, listen, we're having fun. We're working in the industry, growing while we have all these cash flow issues. We're not clearly doing well financially, but we didn't start the company. One of the biggest drivers for probably all of us, definitely me, was to build an organization which stands out. Just not one more vehicle to make some money over here. That doesn't mean that we don't want to do well financially. To build a company which is well known in a long run, I think that's the basics. It was also very evident if you want to be servicing the pharma in US was 50% of the world pharma market, followed by 5 large European markets, then Japan, all this stuff. So we said, we just have to be there. So we said, we got to be in the US. And this person who met us, he was fascinated because of the reasons I just mentioned. We were really fighting it out. The pain, sacrifices, all this stuff was very evident, very modest operation, huge amount of frugality. That's the only way to survive in this whole thing. And we got this advice that what you're trying to do, the healthcare space, it's a tough space. It's going to take some time. And first of all, you can't have a dead investor sitting on your captive. Over here, you'll need some more capital. You'll have to do all this stuff. Otherwise, it's going to be a challenge, which made a lot of sense. We started talking and by that 2004, I would say things were getting slightly better. We decided to try to raise money at that point of time. But we were slightly disillusioned with institutional capital by what we had seen in that whole phase of euphoria. So it almost looked like that you play the markets, which was in contrast to what we were saying, we want to build an enduring organization. So when we started talking to people, that was one option, but we were worried about that. So we were talking to probably everybody who had money in the country, stopping by the point of who could have invested. And we met this family office of one of the founders of Infosys, a person called N.S. Raghavan, was one of the founders of Infi. He was eldest in that whole founding group. So he had retired in 2000 and he had set up his own family office. He was investing in a few companies here or there through some common friends. We got introduced to them. And NSR liked the broader space. He liked us as founders. And they decided to invest, right?
What was the pitch like? Because you were a services business at that time. Like, what did you pitch to NS Raghavan?
So we said we could build a services business only, or we call it solutions that are using technology but a global business. That was a broad pitch in a differentiated space. And I think what you were convinced is that if you think about it, the normal thing to do even in 98, 2000 was to start an IT services firm if you want to become an entrepreneur, right? I live in Koramangala and I keep joking that every alternate street had a IT services firm. They're pretty much the where everybody wants to sell something online over the last 5 years are now a SaaS product. So whatever is the flavor of the day, those days flavor of the day was IT services. But we decided not to do that. We thought we'll build a specialized firm, which was not true at one time. Actually, so there's a massive capital restructuring we did, a fairly complicated one where we got all the old investors out and we came and recapitalized the company with some bit of capital, which we used to then start exploring the US markets more aggressively. By 2005 or so, it was evident to us that while US is definitely an attractive market, very large market. It was also, we are not the only smart guys who had figured it out. It was a much more competitive market. And that's the time when pharma as a sector was extremely comfortable. When I say extremely comfortable, now if you think about it, this is a space or this is the industry which by 2005-07 had an amazing run for decades.
This was when Ranbaxy was at its peak and Ranbaxy used to do a lot of business in the US, I believe.
So I'm talking about global pharma. I'm talking about the truly global pharma. The reality is that from a revenue percentage perspective, the generic was and still is a fraction, very small fraction of the overall industry. Today also it is less than 10% of the overall from a value perspective. That time probably would have been even smaller. So the global pharma industry had a great run. If you think about it, they had solved many, many problems for humankind. Our average life expectancy going up. I think life sciences played a big role in making that happen. Because of the product, while you had taken a lot of risk initially, once you have successful products, you had entry barriers and hence you enjoyed a long run over there. Drug pricing, at least in developed markets, was pretty attractive and hence the margins of life science companies were pretty high. If you compare a life science $50 billion company with a FMCG company of that size, the life science companies was double at an original level, it was double. And hence the market cap was double. You're growing well because of various secular trends. And then all of a sudden you show up saying that, you know what, you have this fragmented way of doing marketing or medical. We have a better way of doing it. You will save some money. Guys won't care. So we realized that to break into this market, it'll be better that we have a US front end. Otherwise, it's going to take a lot of time. So we raised some capital and did an acquisition in the United States in 2005. So we acquired a company almost twice our size and used that as the front in the US. And this team, a company had raised capital from marquee global investors in the United States, had a fully running management team, which was very attractive to us, that they could run the business. And we would add value in various ways we had identified. And we can continue doing many other things. That was a broad thesis of this acquisition. Parallelly, we were expanding into Europe, Southeast Asia. So the whole focus was using our capabilities to become more global in nature.
And what was this company doing which you acquired?
So they were doing some of the things which we were doing over here, the whole medical education piece using content. But they also had a business in training sales reps on scientific and medical issues, not the soft skill training. You think about it, if you're going to launch an oncology drug or a high-end cardiovascular drug or a diabetes drug, you got to get reps to have conversations about the disease and the drug with these super specialists. How do you train them to have those intelligent conversations around science? And when you are talking about markets where product patent was there, it's finally science which sold your contrast in context of the disease areas. So that whole disease material is what we would design. And this company had its own learning management system. It had many tech things which could be used, simulations of practices, bunch of things like that. The tech angle was very strong. Interestingly, one of the founders and CTO of this firm we acquired in 2005 is our global CTO right now, sitting out of LA.
And so they had what in those days used to be called computer-based training, like what today we call edtech.
Yeah, absolutely. In this domain, as I said, a ready-made learning management system, plus a bunch of other tools which could have been used for simulations, as you said, edtech kind of thing for this area. So we acquired them. Now, as things would have it, and that's when I joked that we had a tormented childhood which shaped us as a company. This company, we figured out that we missed some things in diligence, and it was a combination of inexperience and a bunch of other things. There were issues with many. First of all, it was losing money in the first place, which we knew, but we thought we could turn that around over here. But on top of that, there were delivery issues with some big clients, which were not identified during the diligence process. It looked like they're going to lose revenues with those clients, and that happened. By the time we could even intervene,
the invoices got disputed, basically.
Not invoices getting distributed. Clients were not happy with the quality levels being delivered, the price point, bunch of things. So they lost business in the next year, which essentially meant the burn went up. They were even losing money. The burn, and vis-a-vis our thesis of that we'll be able to do things, offshore stuff, build capabilities over here, bring some of our tech, which we had developed. And so we had a 3-year roadmap of how we'll leverage this company, continue to grow while bringing out costs, but that had to be compressed to months.
You would shift the cost centers to India so that
over time. But those capabilities didn't exist in India. That was the issue. So we had to build those capabilities in India in the first place because nobody was doing this out of India at that point of time. And what we also realized, the rigor required to service global pharma customers from a compliance perspective, all the stuff, FDA, was in a completely different league compared to what was required over here. But we had offices in Bangalore plus Bombay and Delhi during that time. Bombay and Delhi, because that's where a lot of the pharma action was in India.
Okay. So those were sales offices.
Actually, not only sales offices, a lot of delivery also happened over there, close to the customer. And when this US thing started happening, we realized that this 3-year timeline has to be crunched in 2 months, 6-9 months or whatever it is. Otherwise, we'll end up burning a lot of cash. So we pretty much had to let go the entire management team in the United States, take over running this company on a day-to-day basis, build a lot of capabilities over here in quick time to be able to change the course. We also realized that this Bombay Delhi thing was an issue because we had to have certain quality standards over here, whereas while we decided that we will have the same quality standards across the board, even if that meant lower margins. But there are a bunch of practices in terms of how you develop content and all the stuff, which were just not going to sit well with global customers. And then having 2 different processes, different cultures, just didn't work. We shut down our Bombay Delhi offices, centralized delivery in Bangalore, built a lot of global systems in terms of quality.
Did you lose business in India by shutting down those offices?
Honestly, I don't remember also because I didn't care at that point of time because the numbers were very different. And not only US, we started winning in the Europe But all these were global customers, very, very large companies who are continuously, even before they start working with you, there will be 3-day audits of your processes, systems, and all that stuff. So we said we can't have our energies distributed and focused. So we service our India customers through Bangalore. I don't think that made such a big impact, by the way, over here. I think the bigger reason for us to continue in Bombay, Delhi is that most of the talent when we started off was available in those markets for the Indian market. And rather than disrupting, it was easier to hire talent if you went that way. But then when the hard calls had to be made, we made those hard calls and invested more in training and development. And so invested heavily in our quality processes, people processes as a firm very early on. As in 2004, of when we started to go to the US, we set up a separate business excellence team, right, as an overhead, which was not easy when you were a 7 crore revenue company and running on your cash flows. There, we set up our HR practices, all this stuff in a fairly robust vision to do training and development, hiring the best people, a bunch of things like that. And training and development was difficult because this domain did not exist in India. So you just couldn't hire experts over here. So we had to get people from the United States to train people over here, especially in things like medical writing, medical illustrations, a bunch of things like that. So it was a pretty, I would say, a rough period we went through because there was a cultural thing also, right? We learning ourselves how to service this market. Then there was obviously issues between teams which you had to manage, the cash flow issues, burning cash, turning that around, letting people go in at the senior level in the United States because we had to take control of this thing. Yeah, so by 2008, 9 or so, we were a nice little business. I forgot the exact revenue numbers, but I would reckon it will be in that $9-ish million range, broadly profitable, generating cash, having some good customers, right? Marquee names in a more project by project business type of format and stable teams. That's where we had reached after a lot of hard work and pain. And that's when we stepped back and again asked the question, where do we go from here?
In India, you were doing content plus distribution. Like you would create the content and you would also distribute like through CDs, through letters, through workshops, seminars, etc. For your global business, was it the same? Were you also, because in India, you would have probably built a database of doctors with their addresses so that you can mail it across to them and so on.
No, so that distribution, while we had built a database and all this stuff, the reality was being done by reps in pharma. By 2002-03, our model had pretty much become all pharma. This doctor direct, I think we had, I would say, pretty much backed out of at that time.
Your deliverable to a pharma company would be just the content or content which is produced, say, in the form of CDs and books and brochures?
Produced complete end to end, ready to be distributed, irrespective of the channel, irrespective of it's a CD, irrespective of whether it's online media. Personally, those were the things which were being used at that point of time. In the US, it was all online, pretty much across the board. We would give you an example of one of the marquee engagements we had done for one of the top 5 global pharma companies that they want to launch. It wasn't a launch, actually. It was they wanted to differentiate one of their oncology products and use the way they want to do it is build what they called a virtual oncology center. So think about online format. If you as a physician go in, there is a patient who walks in and that is being simulated in a 3D type of thing. When people are talking about meta and all that today, without the underlying tech and plumbing, that's pretty much what is happening at that point of time. A patient walks in and then the doctor asks, okay, so what is your problem? So the patient will present their symptoms. Here are the issues I'm facing. Doctor will ask a few more questions, right? And you can ask questions as a doctor. If you're a doctor attending that, you can ask questions. The patient is going to answer that. And the back-end programming has been done with various scenarios. So we would have developed this
chatbot.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's getting recorded. And we would have built the back-end database with well-known oncologists, literature survey, a bunch of things like that at the back. Based on that, you do a provisional diagnosis. Based on the provisional diagnosis, you as a physician get feedback about what you have done. You then order test, and then how you've ordered test, you get feedback on that because it's the cost of ordering tests, especially when you're talking about the United States, that how accurate based on this for your test. You get the test results. Based on that, you finally do the final diagnosis and do prescriptions. You get feedback on that.
And the delivery was through streaming, cloud-based?
Yeah, it was streaming. Yeah, absolutely. Right. So we started on that piece with the pharma and we were doing well on this whole area. We had built a delivery capability in India. Scaling was easy for us, scaling up and down. Costs were definitely more competitive. And we had a US front end, which we had built. So customers were comfortable. Otherwise, customers were not comfortable offshoring some of these kind of things at that point of time.
The US company became like the parent in a way, or it is a subsidiary?
It is a subsidiary. It is still a subsidiary. The holding and parent company is still India.
So yeah, 2009, you were at $9-10 million ARR and you were again in that questioning phase of what next.
Yeah. So when we were in that questioning phase, Parallelly, what was going on is that the pharma industry was going through big churn. If you remember going back, I told you that this was the industry which had a great run for decades. But when you have a great run for decades, one of the drawbacks is that you get some excess fat in the system. That was evident, but for a long period of time, you don't care about it. Who cares? If you're doing well, still markets are rewarding you, then it doesn't matter. But by 2009, there are a few things were happening. And the few things were that it was evident that a lot of companies will lose patents on some of their key products. So close to $200, $250 billion worth of products are going off patent. And when they go off patent, you lose 95% of that revenue. Earlier, that pipeline was filled by new products, but that was not happening at that point of time at the pace which should have happened. And the reason for that was manifold. One is you just had the financial crisis, right? And then every government was stretched. And in most of the developed markets, our government is a major spender in healthcare. The Medicare program in the US is probably the largest spend area, constitutes a fairly significant portion. I don't remember the exact number of the overall healthcare spend. Now, with that, the questioning on if you're going to launch a new product, which is going to be 10, 15 times more expensive than existing generic, was much more intense. That was one thing. The second thing is that between 2005 and 10, there were 2-3 big blow-ups which had happened from a compliance perspective in pharma. One, a painkiller for one of the big companies, and another diabetes product for another company. They were linked to heart disease. And there were issues on what was communicated to physicians was not right, the clinical data which was suppressed. And these companies obviously were fined massively, but FDA also was under some bit of pressure. How could something like this happen? And these were products doing billions of dollars of revenue each. They had to be withdrawn and all that stuff. So FDA had become much more stringent on what they're approving, what they're not approving, and what you could say. So there is a act called Sunshine Act, which had come into the United States because there was also a lot of public pressure on how pharma is influencing physicians, prescription behaviors, bunch of things by enticing them, rewarding them.
The way today we talk about big tech in a negative connotation, I think there was that big pharma had become like a bad word.
There were some of these things which were linked to almost, you think about it, that you are taking doctors out for jaunts, big conferences happening, giving them gifts and those type of things. So there's an act called Sunshine Act which came in that anything which you're doing, I forgot the exact, I think the exact number was $100. Anything more than $100 needs to be publicly disclosed. A bunch of things, those kind of things started coming in, which doctors were very right in interacting because it was just not great for them. Pharma was very about making sure they have all the records, what's going on, and we don't do anything wrong. Because the fines could have been massive. Companies ended up paying tens and tens of billions of dollars of fines over a particular period of 2010 to 15, 16 during this period.
Due to non-compliance with disclosure norms.
Yeah, absolutely. Various things on this side, violating FDA stuff, what you can say, what you cannot say. By this time, this is also a time when China was becoming a very important pharma market and companies were investing in that. Today, it is the second largest pharma market in the world, right after the United States. It was way behind when we had started off. So
because of population and because India also has population, isn't it a reason why?
No, so I think it's a combination of many things. They not so much population was one of the factors, of course, but if you see, Japan also is a large market. Before China, Japan was the second largest market. It was also because of drug pricing. They allowed drug pricing to be there for a couple. While they had various innovative methods to make sure that they can manage distribution to people who can't afford drugs, while letting pharma price drugs, new drugs, and all that stuff at the right prices to make money, which prompted pharma companies to make significant investments in China. So it was an attractive market, but they were investing right heavily into that market.
India has a more restrictive price control regime. That's why it's not such a big market.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing which was happening is that this is just the emergence of digital in pharma. iPads had got launched. Everybody was talking about what was at that point in time called SMAC, social, mobile, all that stuff was becoming buzzwords. But more importantly, I think the whole iPad was a big success in pharma. iPads were given to reps and traditional detail aid, which used to be a calendar-like structure, was replaced by this digital thing. So those conversations around digital which had started. Now it is in this backdrop, we as a company were asking the question, where do we go from here? And we said, you know what, if you really look at companies which are serving the pharma industry, there are three big companies servicing the pharma industry. Three big categories of companies, not big companies. One was CROs, contract research organizations, which do clinical trials and a bunch of things. Now most of the clinical trial companies had become end-to-end providers, but I'll come to that later. But so that was one thing. And that's a time when, by the way, India was very hot on clinical trials as a destination. Probably you would have heard of that. 2010 period, there was a big noise around how, because of the large patient pool, India could be a great place for doing clinical trials, easy to find patients, which is a big issue in most of the trials. There are a bunch of companies, domestic Indian companies, CROs, which are funded. One of those areas where the trend plays up. So this was one of them.
What are some of those team of CROs, prominent Indian CROs?
Sero Clin Farm, right? Vida Clinical Services. You do search, you'll find some of these names. All of them got funded, by the way, by VCs, PEs, and all that stuff. So that happened. And one of the thing we got is that list. So anyway, that was one category. Come back to our evaluation later. The second category was ad agencies. Network agencies do a lot of business with pharma in developed markets. Hundreds of millions of dollars. I've also seen $1 billion, one company doing $1 billion with one ad agency. I prefer stuff. All the communication which is reaching out to physicians and patients being developed. So that is the second thing. The third were what were called contract sales organizations, CSOs. Essentially, when you have a drug which is going to be launched, then you need to have extra bandwidth to be able to communicate to physicians, or when you have a bunch of products which you think you're not going to pay attention to, then instead of you having your people, you outsource it to a CSO, contract sales organization, to manage that. And that was a third category. And by the way, each one...
Medical representatives as a service.
Absolutely. And each one of them had $1 billion revenue companies, not valuation, revenue companies in each categories. So when we stepped back and evaluated this whole space, we said the CRO thing, while India is a hot destination, we don't understand in clinical trials, India is going to be the number of percentage of population coming from India can increase a bit. If it is 7, 8, it can go to 12, 15, but it's going to stop there. FDA is not going to approve a drug which has 50% Indian patients. It has to be a much more distributed thing. And second is, from a differentiation perspective, what do we bring to the table? Anybody can get access to these patients. It's a very operational intense thing. We are even not the regulatory arbitrage guys. And we have if we don't see how we could differentiate, we have no interest in being the 101st clinical trial company in India, even if that means a couple of $1 million of revenue over the next few years. Going back to the whole theme of you want to build something which is unique, differentiated. So we rejected that. The second category was agencies. That was a very old boys club in US and Europe. While there were pressures, some consolidation happening, we realized that coming out of Bangalore, all of a sudden you won't be credible, and probably we were maybe not the agency types over here. CSO looked like an attractive option to us, but we said we're not going to be a CSO. We will stick to our DNA, and instead of CSO, we will be a VSO, virtual sales organization. Our bet was that sales and marketing and a lot of the commercialization processes in pharma will change on the back of technology. And we use broadly technology, which as the word, which was now digital. That's a bet we took in that 2009-10 era.
What would be the difference between a CSO and a VSO?
So you won't have reps on the ground. You'll reach out to physicians using various digital channels, calls, emails, websites, WeChat, programmatic media buying, a lot of analytics at the back, profiling of physicians, various ways, then reaching out to you with the right message, not one size fits all. A US doctor might be more risk averse, and hence to convert you, I might show more safety data versus some Dr. X who's more worried about listening to his peers over here. Which kind of content will be more effective? Which content, which channel? There are multiple channels. There is a strong data layer behind that. And then obviously you have to develop content which can develop this. It's a combination of content, channels, and data, which is going to be more relevant. Now, one of the channels could be a rep still, but it's just one of the channels over here. So that's what we're going to do. And we build capabilities around that. I started investing in tech and various capabilities to do this effectively. We had some wins more on emerging markets initially. We were not credible in the United States, especially. And realized that it's a positioning issue.
What kind of deals did you win? Give me an example.
For example, in APAC, there was a company which was going to launch a product in 5 markets in this region. And they wanted somebody to augment this launch. And the broad model was this: there's almost a pyramid of physicians. Top-notch physicians are going to be the heavy prescribers, medium prescribers, and then probably could be prescribers, but low probability. So we would want to spend most of our rep money and focus on the top 1, probably a little bit of 2. How can you augment us on the first, more on the second, and cover the third primarily from a reach perspective with the messaging on this drug and the broad disease area? We did this for 5 countries for one of the top 10 or 20 pharma companies in this region. So
and you use like social media, performance marketing, like these kind of...
Yeah, so all kinds of channels. We built a website. We had inside sales reps calling out. We put ads, programmatic buying on websites in each of these regions separately. We did physician profiling before that over here to even suggest what kind of content can be used, develop the content in this case also. So we did all that stuff. It's a combination of tech, content, which is one of the big differentiators of the firm, that you have medical doctors, technology guys sitting together and making some of these effective, which by the way had been done earlier also. When I spoke to you about the virtual oncology center, you think about it, the same thing was required even there at that point of time. So that was the DNA of the firm. So we did this in these markets, but we were not winning enough in the US. And we realized it was more of a positioning issue because we were perceived more as a medical company and not, but this required a bunch of more capabilities. Actually, while we had those capabilities, US was a much more sophisticated and market which puts you in buckets. And we had to break those buckets as a small firm, especially you get placed in buckets much more easily. So by that time, we had grown out of our ghost of that acquisition, which was a very torturous one. And friends, some of our board members, everybody is saying, listen, guys, the world has moved on. Why don't you also forget that? Let's get. So we did a small acquisition in Canada, a company well known in this space and not done well, but we acquired that company in 2012 and made that again in the front for our offerings in this area in the United States.
And this company was doing this exact same, like virtual sales.
Part of that, but it was well known. It was a very strong brand in that thing in the United States. And we added a bunch of things onto this company. They had 1 or 2 channels, some capabilities.
What were they doing like when you acquired at that stage?
You talk about in terms of revenues or? So they were doing a lot of things on basically websites, essentially helping companies leverage physicians visiting websites, right, at the point of time. And some of the well-known websites, WebMD, bunch of other areas like that MD Consult. So that was one thing they were significant. They also had a technology platform which they were selling to pharma to able to do all this stuff effectively. So some of the remote engagement pieces. So it's a combination of few of these things this company was doing. We acquired them. And so we did that. We did a couple of other tuck-in acquisitions. By the way, and all this through our internal accruals during this period. We had our initial things that taught us that, we don't want to be dependent.
Tuck-in acquisition?
Tuck-in acquisition is like acquisition we would call it, we'll do for capabilities. For example, here's the problem I got to solve. It might be a capability. It might have been a tech platform, but it's almost you're saying build up my decision. I could build this, but it might take 3-4 years. I'm going to build this at X cost. Instead of 1.5x or 2x, if I buy it right now, it's probably worth 2 years I save. Not an acquisition you do for size, scale, bunch of things, which was, again, conventional wisdom, which was being given to us, right? At the point of time, why don't you raise much more capital, this thing, but we weren't convinced that's the right thing to do, and for various reasons. Now, we did this stuff. Now, what happened is when pharma was going through all these changes, they started, while we didn't go after the AEs, they started saying, we got to do things more efficiently. Some of the things we are doing on the medical side, internally or in a very fragmented way, can be industrialized. Digital can be bought in, automation can be bought in. A lot of the stuff which we are doing with agencies is very fragmented, decentralized. 500 agencies working with us in some of our key markets doesn't make any sense. We got to centralize that to 3-5, and what agencies do a few things well, let them do that. But if they do 10 things, 4 or 5 of them are probably not done best by them. We could centralize them across brands, across countries, and start moving towards how a digital first organization should be working. When they started looking for partners, here we are doing all these things. While we were much smaller, which was a worry for some of these companies, because if you're a $70 billion company, you have this small firm, which looks interesting. But just because of the differentiation, we could get our foot into the door and win contracts. And we grew on the back of that between 2010 and 16. 16, 17 had a pretty steady growth, some tuck-in acquisitions here or there.
So in this period, you were essentially like the go-to-market partner for pharma companies. Like when they would want to take out a new drug, then you would do both content and outreach.
It's not necessarily only a new drug. It's essentially so our theme today, and that's what we very quickly got down to. We said, listen, we help you commercialize your products using modern commercial and medical capabilities in organizations. And essentially, modern means digital first, analytics driven. Commercialization means some of the things on sales and marketing. Could be for a new drug, it could be for a growth product, could be for a product declining. The strategies you use are different. The channels you use, the strategy you use might be different, but the underlying capabilities remain same over here. Similarly, on the medical side of things, by this time we had that also. Pharma has these broad. Actually, if I take a step back, pharma does discovery in the labs, which is where the science happens. You file a patent once you got something in animals going, you have enough data. You file for 2 things. One is you file for a patent and you go to FDA for asking for approvals to do clinical trials. Clinical trials happen. That whole thing is called clinical development, which has a lot of medical clinical trials happening.
And which is what
CIOs do. At that point of time, you also have divisions called regulatory teams, which are essentially doing a lot of the submissions and all that with FDA, liaising with them at point of time. There is a team called Medical Affairs, which essentially sits between the commercial organizations and some of these clinical organizations, which is responsible for all the scientific interactions and the communication is going to happen with physicians. So it sits between those So by the time your drug is in phase 2, these kind of teams come in forth and saying, how will you position it? What will be the medical messaging? They are the ones interacting with physicians, start going out to the market, doing multiple things, publications, publishing your results in some of the reputed journals, which can then be used as evidence to take out to physicians, answering queries from physicians, medical queries. That whole process is called medical information management. Any material which you're putting out to physicians needs to go through a process called medical legal review. In pharma, you just can't put out anything. It has to be substantiated by claims. Got to be comfortable whether you're making the right statement or you cannot be superlative. The FDA is going to come after you in a big way. So this team is the one which vets all this stuff. We started supporting them. Then there is a whole process around safety, drug safety. This is a massive process. And this is for, actually, I would say, while it is there for products being developed, the bigger one is for products in the market. If you have a issue, safety event, adverse event for your drug, and your physician or you or somebody else reports that, then there's a host of actions which trigger, which include reporting to the regulator. And if there are enough and more signals that this is a common thing, then you got to modify your label, which is a regulatory thing. So it's a fairly complex combination of medical and commercial process. So we are supporting all these for pharma using a digital first approach. But 2016-17, while we had grown, one of the far issues was that we had realized that pharma is still doing digital in a very tactical way. Everybody had to do, iPads were there and you will have something on the iPad. Everybody had probably as part of their OKRs, KRAs, whatever you want to call them, they got to do something digital. So there'll be a tick mark type of a thing, right? It was very tactical. We were growing on back of that. But 2016-17, we started seeing that change in pharma. We were working with a lot of big pharma companies and we started seeing their internal conversations, internal PPTs, which were at a board level around priorities, around digital changing things. And our take is that was happening because by that point in time, the FANG companies were fairly successful, more than successful, I would say. And every board was probably asking a question, not in our industry, probably every industry. What does it mean for my industry? What does it mean for my company as an opportunity and a threat, right? Now, how do I deal with this? And the conversation had got elevated at that level. When we saw that, it was very evident to us that, listen, we just got to focus on this piece over here. In 2014, we had also got into healthcare providers and payers as part of our thing on the back of Obamacare. If you remember 2014 or so, Obamacare, 2013 or whatever it is, was year Obamacare had been launched. And we saw an opportunity to get in that area. We had started a business, which in 2016-17, the new administration came in, was floundering because the US industry itself changed drastically. Some of our small customers on the healthcare payer side went burst because of the regulatory changes, nothing from a business model perspective. So on one hand, we were seeing pharma in areas which we had bettered long time back, becoming more strategic. On the other hand, we had a bunch of other things and we realized this is our time, but we'll have to get focused. So we shut down and merged a lot of things which we had got into at that point of time, rehash them to become more relevant, those capabilities for the pharma thing, double down on our investments in digital and tech to make this digital first really work. We did a few more acquisitions. 2016, we did a few acquisitions. 2019, we acquired a consulting firm in Europe focused on digital consulting for life sciences as exclusively, because we realized that when companies are working with a company like ours, or actually when they are working with anybody to that extent, and they are using a very new operating model, centralization, their internal processes changing, they're laying out a roadmap, what capabilities to build internally, what to outsource, how, a bunch of things like that. And they needed handholding to some extent. We realized we needed a consulting layer to be having a seat at the table earlier. And the deal sizes are becoming larger. So we had to make a call whether we build or buy a consulting thing. And we were evaluating both. That's when we came across this firm in 2019, which we acquired. 2016, we had done a few acquisitions. By the way, and all these 7 acquisitions between 2012 till 19 were all, as I said, internal accruals, currently just plowing by the cash we were generating into the business through this whole period. 2016-17, we also had contemplated doing a P round, and it was to raise some bit of primary capital to do acquisitions more strategically, because it was not easy to do acquisitions out of your balance sheet when you were still at a small balance sheet. Plus, the fact is we realized that we had investors, we had no pressure, but it was just from a fiduciary perspective, a little bit of exit helps in this thing. So we had gone onto the market for...
Who were on your cap table at that time in 2016? NSR?
That's it. The reality is, as founders also, we wanted to generate some bit of liquidity for us after 16, 17 years. We had started drawing salaries from 2005, but they were always subpar, right? And we were running the company very tightly, as you can imagine, if you're doing acquisitions to cash flow out of your margins. That was the case. But 16, 17...
And what was your ARR in 2016, 17? Like what kind of...
16, I am thinking we had done 52 to be more precise. But somewhere in the process, while we had firm term sheets and all that stuff, we realized when we were, same thing, what I told you in the market was happening. Because when I say market, the customer side of the equation, we started observing these, and it was evident to us that we'll have to make changes internally, shutting down some of our units, rehashing them, investing in a few areas, which was not business as usual. Some of this stuff will have to be done. And while we got term sheets, we realized it's not going to be fair to get a new investor whom you told a story and then you realize you got to do all this stuff. So it might slow us down. So we as founders had discussions internally. We realized that should we do this? And everybody was of the opinion we should not. After working so hard for a long time, for a couple of years now, blowing this up and creating more problems for ourselves and somebody else is not a good thing. Luckily, we had investors who supported the view. They said, doesn't make sense. They said, we are not in no hurry. We had a good run with you guys. And like the business, you guys, everyone, so we can stay on. This is no issue. So we pulled out of that whole process, by the way, in that period. We continue to then invest in the business, grow it, and just double down on our capabilities, market presence. Then 2020 happened. Like everybody else, you were scared the beginning, what's going to happen, world has come to an end. And tracked our business very closely during that point of time. I remember first thing we did is that drew down cash from everywhere. We had limits and all this stuff, US, India, saying that they just sit on cash. But then we started seeing that our customers, after a couple of months, we realized that they were doing more because they didn't have an option. The biggest thing, when people used to ask me, what is the biggest bottleneck for you? So the thing was that it's digital adoption in life science companies. Now, we can influence a little bit by doing thought leadership and all this stuff. But listen, at $1.5 trillion industry, you can't bend the curve for it. You got to be prepared when the curve bends. We realized that the curve is bending, right, in 2020. And that's when
companies were forced to adopt more digital.
Do more. And we found ourselves in a unique spot of being probably the company as a standalone company with this kind of characteristics and experience of doing this for more than a decade with some of the largest companies on the planet over here and successfully. So we benefited from that and had a good jump between 2020 and 2022. And somewhere in 2021, actually 2020, we also had thought as part of our initial plan that we will do the PE process in 2020. The agreement we had between us and our investors is that we will not even try before 2020. That time is required to do this thing, but 2020 or 2021 is when we'll start the process. late 2020, we started the process. And we got 2 new institutional capital partners in early 2021 onto our cap table. So Carlyle, which I'm sure you and your listeners will be aware of, came in as an investor. Another firm called Brighton Park Capital, which is a US firm based out of Connecticut, also came in. Brighton Park was a B firm started by a person called Mark Zaga, who understood India very well. He was the chief investment officer of General Atlantic for a long period of time and led a lot of the investments he had made in India for a lot of time, right? So brought both of them as investors into the company in 2021. So that's broadly where we are. Today, we see the industry.
You raised about 200 million like in that.
Yeah.
This must have been like a unicorn round, I'm guessing.
It wasn't a unicorn round. It was just below a unicorn round at that point of time. Yeah.
And what did you close last year at? What's your ARR?
So last year, revenues were $223 million.
Wow, amazing. Okay. I want to understand that evolution of business a little better. 2016, when you decided that you need to do a little bit of retooling in the organization, build more capabilities. So in 2016, you were a VSO, or like you told me you had got into other areas?
So the business, actually, even before 26, what had happened, we started the concept of VSO, but really the traction we got was after some point of time, and the scaling happened in a slightly different area over here, which is essentially the whole agency thing, which I spoke about. Essentially what we call is centers of excellence for commercial and medical. As pharma companies started saying, listen, we got to industrialize. We have very fragmented processes on the commercial side and medical side. We got to industrialize them, bring digital and automation to them, which meant that the way we do things internally, the way we outsource got to change, and we got to centralize many of these functions. So they started looking for partners like us to develop content, campaigns, and data analytics, in many cases on the medical side, manage some of the regulatory safety and medical affairs process and support them at a scale. That's where we got a lot of our growth from. So the combination of the commercial and medical side is still our largest.
Medical side would be like a flow automation, basically.
It's not workflow automation. I'll give an example of a process. Was 2013 or 12, I forgot the exact thing, but a pharma company came to us and there is this whole process called labeling. There's a label in every drug you have. The label is a highly regulated document. And you think that label has claims the drug is making over here, which has to be approved by FDA. and all this stuff. Now you think about it, there is a document called core data sheet, which you have all the core data of the pharma company. From there, the label is derived, and there's a global label. Now, if you're a large pharma company, you might be selling in 80 markets across the world. And each of those markets will have their own regulations. You got to be compliant at a global level with your stuff. You got to be compliant in each of these 80 markets. And regulations in any of these markets could change. And you got to be complying, making sure you are in line with those regulations. One. The second thing is you might have a safety event, which necessitates you to change the label, global level. You might have new trial results which have come in, because of which you're modifying the label after FDA approvals and all that stuff. That need to reflect in each of these things. In context of the regulations, this company, which was a top 5 pharma company, came to us after they had some inspections and audit findings and issues. And they realized that they were 45% compliant, which is a big risk for a company like that. So they set up a global labeling hub with us to manage these labels in 80 countries. That's an example of the medical side of things.
So is this productized? Like I can imagine label management being as a product in itself.
It's a combination of, and that's broadly our strategy. There are capabilities, things are done in a certain way today, and most of that are capabilities, human capabilities. And that is paramount. Now, what we have done over time, when I said investments in tech, is that we have been investing in AI-based solutions which sit in conjunction with these capabilities. The reality is none of these are driverless cars today. There are different levels of automation which have been introduced to reduce the human effort, reduce errors, increase compliance, but the capability needs to sit this today. A combination of regulations and maturity of these algorithms haven't reached a stage where you could do this thing. But we believe it's obviously over years, both these evolve, more and more data, more and more maturity of technology and regulatory frameworks evolving. It will get there, whether it's 3 years, 5 years, or 10 years, that's anybody's guess right now. The way we have placed ourselves
right now, it's a managed service where tech is helping you to deliver better outcomes at lower costs.
And that's what we do for all the things over here. And those are the investments we made. We want to deliver differentiated outcomes vis-a-vis any of the incumbents in this space. The interesting thing is that if you really think about it, one of the things I keep speaking about is that people, especially in India, know about the whole contract manufacturing, CDMO as it's called, space. There are very successful companies in this. If you see the spend, sales and marketing is the largest spend area in pharma. And by the way, we can share numbers with you. It's a pretty large spend area, more than 20% of revenues being spent on sales and marketing for these companies. The reason, first of all, and there were large companies in the United States and Europe in this space. The reason you didn't hear about it so much is there was a fragmented spend. Every country, every brand, as I said, doing their own things. Now, over the last I would say decade, which is now accelerating, is companies are realizing that does not work. It's a combination of many things, more pressure on bottom lines, more risk of non-compliance, you doing something which is not in compliance norms. And the third thing is companies are also realizing that if you want to be truly digital, like the digital natives, you can't have this fragmented stuff. There could be some things which are fragmented or autonomy, but the core infrastructure level, you got to have centralized functions. Otherwise, you'll never know your customers better. You'll never be able to deploy strategies. And that is driving more consolidation and centralization of things. And then that's where a company like us becomes more relevant and has a large area to play on and win larger deals, which has also driven a lot of this growth we have seen.
Got it. You were giving me another example in addition to labeling on the medical side.
I spoke about the whole area of medical legal review. Now, if you think about it, you develop material. Some of our engagements will be the following, that we would be engaged by the commercial team, and the commercial teams will engage us for, let's say, 35 markets, right, across the world. That, anything which is going out to physicians, while we'll have few agencies which will be doing steps 1, 2, 3, after step 1 or 2, 3, they will hand over the stuff to you guys. You will take it all the way to 10, and then that gets deployed in the market. But before it gets deployed in the market, this whole thing needs to go through a medical legal review process in each of these markets. Now, the company would be doing that. Given our medical capabilities, what we started saying is that, listen, this medical legal process is a very intense process. Checking is happening at multiple levels, from basic English to claims, references, all the stuff is to medical review, and you have only so much teams and you want them to do operational work. So we could support that. So we would have a separate contract, and it's required from a regulation perspective, a firewall contract with the medical organizations to support that process. So the material which we have developed goes to a pharma company, get thrown across the world to the medical teams, comes to a team over here in Indegene, which is firewalled from this other team, gets back, and then it goes And once that is approved, the final signatory is the pharma company. Then it goes to the market. That's another process. I can go on, and there are a bunch of things on the medical and commercial side. Now, what I described to you on the commercial side is a fully end-to-end process. But within that, there are nuances. That one is content, other is how you deploy campaigns, data and analytics. Companies are buying platforms, software platforms. And then you got to use and customize those platforms, run them to drive more ROI.
Say someone is deploying Salesforce, that you would customize and make sure.
Customize and then run Salesforce on a day-to-day basis. And that's where, again, domain layer is required. So wherever there's an intersection of domain expertise and tech, that's where we continue to expand as a company. And our filter is not only tech, but it has to be domain. That's where we can truly stand out as a company, and not necessarily from an India perspective, but if you think about it, there are many firms our size, scale, standalone across the world in this domain. And that's what we choose to when we think about getting into an adjacency or a new area.
What is the role of data and analytics? Give me some examples of how that solves problems.
A classic thing is this physician profiling itself, understanding a physician well, like I spoke to you about. That's the core thing. Now, we still do the VSO thing. It's a small portion of our revenue, but now we are gaining traction. That first of all, how do you figure out to even get your physician list? Identifying which are the physicians to go after. One is a very simple thing on prescribing, which is the easy one. But then you also do digital profiling. If a physician is a heavy prescriber, but you know what, he or she is digital savvy, then you could have a strategy where you have somewhat of rep coverage, but you can still have a extensive digital thing. But if it's not digitally savvy, then you might want to have more rep coverage. That's a basic point. So you're getting your physician list. Then what we call shortest path to prescription or influencing behavior, to understand that having algorithms and data essentially to figure out which channels, which content pieces, right, will get the most amount of traction for these physicians. Understanding patient journeys in the first place from real world data. There is a plethora of data sources that emerged over the last decade. Given that electronic medical records now, for the exact numbers, but I believe they used to be 6-7% in 2014, in 2006-7, actually 8 before Obama, the Meaningful Use Act came in the United States. Now it is in that 80s or 90% over there, which throws in a lot of data, and government is making that more usable. There's claims data from an insurance perspective. There's genomic data. So you can use all this stuff to really understand patient journeys much better. And in that context, figure out your messaging and a bunch of other things on the marketing side. The same thing is also being used on the clinical trial side much more effectively.
Are you also doing B2C marketing, like to the end consumers, or is it just the marketing to physicians that you do?
So it's not marketing to end consumers, and end consumer marketing is allowed only in a few countries. US is one of them. Where if you still see US, most of the TV ads will be, but that's a very kind of thing. So we don't do that. But what we do is what is called patient adherence, supporting on chronic therapies. How do you engage patients that don't drop out, educating them, reminding them, bunch of other things. More and more, if you see the pipeline of drugs and where the pharma focus is today, it's on very specialized products. Oncology is a big one, because that's where a lot of the unmet medical needs are, and rare diseases. These are complex therapies, very expensive therapies. So bringing patients on board, the interface with the insurance companies, whether the patient is authorized to have a drug or not, then keeping the patient on the therapy. Those are the kind of involved processes a company like ours will be more involved in.
So this keeping a patient, like this patient adherence would be through like emails, messages and all? Is there a patient app for a patient suffering from, let's say?
It's a combination of everything. There are apps, there are patient counselors, nurse counselors, again, by the way, websites. So it's very similar to that whole physician thing to that extent. You have multiple channels to reach out to patients.
So which line of business contributes how much to your revenue? And which country contributes how much to the revenue?
So from a country perspective, it's US, which is the largest. It's going to be, I forgot the exact number, but 2/3 of our business. Now, we count this from a contracting perspective. What that means is that we might have contracted in the US, but we might still be doing work for Europe or some other parts of the world.
Okay. Because the head office is in the US. So
office, even by the way, head office is not US, is such a large center of gravity for most of the pharma companies that they might be doing contracting. Europe ones also might be doing contracting over there. So US tends to be 2/3 or 70% of that piece, followed by Europe, then China, or Japan and India. So the way we look at our lines of business is, we call it enterprise commercial, enterprise medical, and then our VSO business is we call it omnichannel activation now. So if you take the enterprise commercial and omnichannel activation, That's more on the commercial side. That will be the largest portion of our business, followed by enterprise medical. And then we have what we call others, some bit of consulting. We have just four into enterprise clinical, digital clinical trials. That's almost a startup within Indegene. That will be a few percentage points.
How is digital clinical trials different from the regular clinical trials?
So you are, first of all, there are many things. One is they're using real world data, real world evidence to in the whole trial design process more effectively. The protocol designs in the first place are much more data driven in the first place.
This design would include decisions like who should be my sample size, which countries should I test this on, and so on. Which
actually it will be much more nuanced than that. It will be what should be my endpoints, what should be my exclusion criteria, inclusion criteria. We see a typical trial.
Endpoint means like the hospital or the clinic where the trial happens.
No, so what type of patients? When you are coming up with a drug, when you're doing trials, you're trying to get a label, as I had explained. That label has exclusion inclusions. If you would have, at the very simplistic way, it would say not for pregnant women, not for children. Now that's much more nuanced than what I just explained. Based on the data you have generated initially, you are saying where is the higher probability of success for this drug so that I generate positive data and get into the market over here. Using real-world data, real-world evidence, you can increase that probability of success. But that's another example of using data analytics in the first place. Then identifying the sites and identifying the investigators in a much more rigorous way. You think about it, as I just mentioned, the real-world, the orphan diseases, oncology drugs are the most prominent ones in the whole pipeline. How do you get patients onto trials? You don't have large numbers of patients in this. If you're using a cholesterol drug or a hypertension drug, it's easy to recruit. Pretty much everyone has that. But some of these patient recruitment, it's a problem. So using
that, then again, you would use like digital campaigns.
Digital channels can be used to, again, recruit patients in those areas. So there are a few areas like that where we are trying to get and drive more effectiveness in the whole clinical trial process.
Partner with traditional CROs to execute, or you partner directly with these components, say a clinic, a hospital, and a...
Pretty much all our business is directly with pharma. We contract directly with pharma, then go and execute.
When you're executing the clinical trial, do you execute it in-house?
So we are not doing full and full the operational part of the clinical trials. We are still not doing. We are taking pieces which can be disintermediated, made better. So we are trying to unbundle that process and add efficiency in that. In the pieces where digital or data can play a significant role. Again, we are still staying true to that whole thing of where we believe we can truly add value and stay differentiated. Over time, obviously, those pieces increase.
And this commercial and omnichannel together would be like more than half your top line? Or?
Yeah, it's more than half. There will be 60% or so. It's slightly more than that, yeah.
Do you see post-COVID that more pharma are like reducing reliance on in-person visits, going more for omnichannel, like what you are offering? Is there a trend?
That is definitely happening. And it's a function of, it worked in during COVID. The average loaded cost of a rep in the United States is north of $250K US dollars. Well, it's fairly expensive. Now, there are places where you need a rep. So I'm not saying rep is going to go away completely. It's going to be there, but the use of digital is going to be more and more prominent because of a few reasons. One, it's fairly expensive, whereas digital is much more efficient. It's much more targeted. You can do much more personalized things. Second thing is more and more doctors are now preferring to have pull rather than push in this world of today. They are just like you and me. I don't want to be called every now and then. I'll call you if I have something. And most of my information I can anyway get through various channels. Last but not least is pharma is also worried about compliance. A rep having a conversation with a physician, there's only so much you can control it over here from a compliance perspective. Whereas digital, all your messaging is controlled. What you're saying, you have a complete audit trail of all that stuff. And hence, from a compliance perspective, it's much less risky.
Is there such a thing as like influencers in this, like doctor influencer who would make TikTok videos?
So those are what are called KOLs, key opinion leaders, right? Some physicians whom the world will or particular country will listen to. So typically you target them. They are the ones you would probably even get during your clinical trials in the first place. If not clinical trials, those are places where you'll, during your initial marketing process, and that's where medical affairs plays a role, as I had mentioned. You convince them through science about your drug. And if you got them converted, it becomes definitely that plays a role.
Advice would you give to yourself when you were starting way back in 2000? Or which is another way of asking, what advice would you give to a young founder?
A few things. Bill Gates uses a statement, at least have been attributed to us. We always overestimate what we can do over a 2-year period and always underestimate what can be done over a 10-year period. That is so true. That's one piece of advice I would give.
So you're saying that have a 10-year plan. when you're starting a business.
But 10-year horizon at least. It takes that much of time to build something meaningful. The second thing is think about the market. In my mind, there are two things entrepreneurs have to do. First of all, identify opportunities where you can build businesses. But while identifying those opportunities, you've got to be really critical on thinking about how the market is going to be shaping up over here. And there's no way to be 100% sure over there. There will always be probability. But many times we as entrepreneurs have more wishful thinking about how things are going to change and the pace they're going to change than what reality is. Right? Be more real if you're building an enduring business around that piece. Your vision can still be achieved over a period of time, but don't depend on just financial cycles to run this whole thing. Be much more rigorous on that. So that's one part the entrepreneur does. The second part, which at least we will, I believe, has kept us in good stead. We said, you know what, we're going to be entrepreneurial in nature. But on the other hand, we also will always be prudent and think about institution building teams, building processes which can execute on that opportunity. So you can move on to the next thing. We always focus on that. And many times these conflict, being entrepreneurial, thinking about institutions, being prudent, they conflict. Got to find the right balance to strike that. Many times going in one direction more could be much more, could just be detrimental and you can blow up over here.
And that brings us to the end of this conversation. I want to ask you for a favor now. Did you like listening to this show? I'd love to hear your feedback about it. Do you have your own startup ideas? I'd love to hear them. Do you have questions for any of the guests that you heard about in this show? I'd love to get your questions and pass them on to the guests. Write to me at ad@thepodium.in. That's ad@thepodium.in.